Buongiorno a David Leavitt, uno dei più importanti scrittori contemporanei, e benvenuto a Book City.
Grazie.
So we will talk of this speech in English, even if you speak Italian very well. But we decided to do it this way. I think it will be better, and we can go deeper in some of the issues we want to talk about.
Okay.
The first thing I wanted to ask you, we have been passing through a very complicated and difficult period. Which were your feelings during the last months, both as a human being and as a writer?
Confused, frightened, destabilized. I want to say that after January 20th, when the Trump presidency ended, things got, in certain ways, much, much easier because the Trump years were, I think, personally incredibly frightening and confusing, simply because Trump was totalmente pazzo, and it was like being inside the mind of a schizophrenic, from one thing to another, to another, to another. So there was a kind of incredible instability. Since Biden has become president, the instability is gone, mostly, but there's a sense of, I think, stagnation, perhaps, with the government, that is frustrating. And of course, COVID is the perpetual source of, is the perpetual, the thing that never goes away, and that, affects our lives in so many ways, big and small. As I'm sure you know, in this country, the biggest problem we're having, and this has been particularly true in Florida, has been the demonization of vaccines by the Republican Party, and the resultant surge in COVID among people who are not vaccinated. Well, I live in a state with a pretty monstrous Republican governor, Ron DeSantis. So where I live, my town, we're fine, but we've had to fight for what ought to be normal. We've had to fight for sanity against insanity, and that's very, very exhausting.
The hashtag we use for these conversations is after. So you have
It's
been
not
introduced.
after.
It's not. We're not after.
We're not after.
We're still in.
We're in it.
And did your habits as a reader change during these months?
As a reader?
Yes, reading, the way you read books, did it change?
I haven't been reading very much for the last year or so, and that's partly because I've been writing a lot, and it's partly because I read so much for my work. As a professor and as an editor, I read sort of all day, and so usually by the time the evening comes around, I'm tired of reading. But I'm convinced more and more that that is making my life worse, because I think that reading the literature that I love is actually very, very healthy. And so, today, for a class that I'm teaching, I was rereading R.K. Narayan, the great Indian writer, and it was so refreshing. It was like drinking a glass of cool water, because I thought, yes, this is literature. This isn't material that I have to judge, or that I have to critique, or that I have to, respond to. I can just read it.
And
But I've been watching a lot of movies.
that's what I was asking you. What do you do when you don't read? And you answer, I watch movies.
Movies and old television shows from the 50s and 60s. But mostly, a friend of mine made a joke that in the last year we both should have get a degree in film studies. We've watched so many films.
And did your creative process change in these months? Did the pandemic in some ways affect the way you write?
Yes, in one principal way. I realized that I absolutely could not write about the present day. I have to live in the present day, and I need what I write to be a kind of. I felt like I needed to move into the past. There's a great line by Grace Paley, who is my among American writers my sort of inspiration. She's without her I would never have become a writer. It's something about how the world, you have to be able to know the world in order to describe it. And when things are so uncertain, I prefer to return to the past, which is at least completed. I know this because for the magazine that I edit this season, I guess you could say, questa stagione, I'm seeing a lot of quarantine stories, a lot of lockdown stories, and they're not very good. And I think it's because we need time as human beings and as writers to digest. Another great line of Grace Paley's, there's a long time between knowing and telling. And things, again, the situation changes so quickly that, my feeling is that if I write a story set yesterday, I'm writing historical fiction. I don't dare write a story set tomorrow because I don't know what tomorrow is going to be. So I've gone back to the 19th century.
You told us that you are editing a magazine. Can you tell us something about it?
Yeah. Subtropics, it's called. I've been editing it since 2006. And it's a literary journal. We publish stories, essays, and poetry. I don't do the poetry. I have a colleague. And it's a terrific magazine. We publish a lot of work in translation, and we publish very famous established writers, and we publish new writers. But it's a lot of work. It's a lot of reading.
And a magazine is fully in the present time, in the present moment. How can you put together the idea that you told us before, that to tell stories, to write, you need time, and at the same time you need to publish something now in this present moment?
I try to avoid publishing things that are overly topical or that are, because our preoccupations change so quickly, and what seems really important one week, you never know if it's going to last. There's that expression that people use in the news media. I think it's like, will this story fade away, or will it persist? And so I tend to publish what seem to me timeless. I try to look for timeless essays and stories that are somehow not overly dependent on the moment in which they take place, even if that moment is now.
And
how long? Yeah, go ahead. No, that's all.
How long does it take for experience for your life to get into stories in your experience?
For me, more and more time as I get older. When I was young, I could write. Writing was a lot easier for me when I was younger. I think it is always easier for younger people because as you get older, you have so much more memory. I always say I'm like an old PC. The more memory, the more you slow down. And if you teach and you edit, you also become very self-conscious, very aware of like every word, every sentence. So and of course also I've lived so much longer that I have much more of a sense of history than I used to. So yeah, it slows down more and more with time. I think that's a natural process for most writers, but I think it's been particularly difficult in these years for me personally. I think other people can do it. Maybe younger people can do it more easily. Although curiously, my students who are all in their 20s, they don't want to write about the present day because they don't want to have their characters sending texts. We had a long talk about this. So they're all setting their fiction in the 80s and 90s, pre-cell phone, because they don't like having cell phones in their novels. It's very interesting.
And why don't they don't like to put cell phones in their novels?
I think because they're well read and they've read a lot of literature from the past, and they understand that in fiction, drama takes place when people talk, not when they text. It's very, very hard to dramatize texting. We all text constantly, but I think you can maybe have some of it, but it's a challenge, and I think it's a challenge that this current generation of writers is kind of struggling with. Some writers have, I think, used it to their advantage, and I'm thinking specifically of writers like, I don't know how well these writers are known in Italy, Patricia Lockwood, Lauren Euler, who are writing fiction which is really about online life. Others just want to run away from it, and they almost want to return. They see the pre-internet world as a kind of a lost Eden that they would like to return to.
And how do you feel? What is your personal feeling towards this new world in your fiction? How can you deal with that?
I tried to in my last novel, and I included some texting, and but I didn't. It was very, very important to me to actually have human conversations that people have either in the same room or over the telephone. I think a certain amount of texting in fiction is fine. And I'm speaking purely for myself. I know of young writers who are able to use texting in their fiction very well. Sally Rooney, in her first novel, Conversation with Friends, used it extremely skillfully. But it's not easy, because the thing about texting is that it's endless and it's saved. So if you look at, your history of texting with someone, it goes back years, and there's no shape, there's no structure. That is, I think, the challenge, because fiction has to have structure. How do you incorporate something that is so shapeless into a work into a form of art in which structure and shape are so important?
We go back in time, and we get to 1984, when your first book appeared, which is Family Dancing. And now I have here the new edition by Sam with a new translation. Yes. So first of all, how do you feel? What are your feelings towards a book that is quite old now?
I feel like it was written by someone else. I recognize, it's like looking at a picture of yourself as a child. You recognize yourself and you have memories, but it seems like a different life. So when I look at that book, I sort of find that it brings me back to a person, a young person, the young person I used to be. Well, obviously that's me, but it doesn't. I feel as if when I read these books that I didn't write them. I think, wow, that's good. That's a good story, but
They
it's
are good
almost written by
stories.
someone else.
They are very good stories, so it's okay.
Yeah,
And
and then I start to worry that I did all my best work when I was young, and then I started having an anxiety and a panic attack about it. So, what can I say?
and
I'm a
why
bit of
did
a
you decide to have a new translation by Fabio Cremonesi now?
why the new translation?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, Delfina Vezzoli, my former translator, was someone I absolutely loved and whom I have really tried to memorialize. But as Fabio and I talked about it, we realized that it was translated at a time when Italian vocabulary, particularly relating to, I don't even know what word to use anymore, queer, gay, LGBTQ life, was a little cagier, a little less direct. And so I think the idea was to sort of freshen the vocabulary, to make it more accessible to a generation of Italians who this many years later, not only have different attitudes, but an entirely different vocabulary.
From another point of view, I see that big classics need to be translated again every generation. So in some ways, are you becoming a classic? Do you feel you're becoming a classic because of this translation?
Uh, um, Maybe in Italy, I'm very pleased. It's gratifying, but I don't have, as a writer, I don't actually have a lot of self-confidence. I don't think of myself as, I think it's actually a dangerous thing when writers get too grand, when they start thinking, well, every word I write is gold. It almost always ends up turning to lead, to use a metaphor from alchemy or reverse alchemy. I've seen that with a lot of extremely famous writers. I won't name any names, but there are certain writers who are deservedly, world famous, but haven't written a decent book in 30 years or 20 years. And I think it is partially because of a certain kind of sense of they don't feel they have to prove anything, and so there's no life. I'm the opposite. I feel like with every book I'm 4 years old again, and I'm learning to read for the first time.
And a translation is in some way a rewriting of a book. Do you have the temptation of writing again your older books or correcting your text? Never.
Never. I don't even want to look at them. I think that's a big mistake. Henry James made it.
Yes, lots of writers do it.
It's almost always a mistake. You have to accept that what the book is what it is, and even if time has passed and you have changed, you can't. You just have to let it be what it is. I'd rather put my energy into new work than into returning to old work. This is also why I never write. I have never written a sequel. There was a period when people kept saying, "Why don't you write a sequel to The Lost Language of Cranes?" And I didn't want to, because I didn't have anything more. I couldn't think of a good reason to, except for perhaps commercial reasons. But there's nothing worse than a bad sequel. I mean, we know that from films, right?
Of course.
The Phantom Menace.
Another thing that is very interesting in your career is that at a certain point you began writing nonfiction.
Yes, that's what I'm doing
Why
now.
did you decide this, and why did you decide the subject of these nonfiction books?
Well, the first nonfiction books that I wrote were both commissioned. My book about Florence, Firenze, Florence, a Delicate Case, and then my book about Alan Turing. Those were both books that I was asked to write.
This is the Alan Turing book.
Yes, that was a commissioned book. But if I had not written that book, I would not have written The Indian Clerk, Il Matematico Indiano, which is probably my favorite of my own books. I'm now working on nonfiction by choice. And why did I choose the subject? I have no idea. It was not anything I ever intended to write about, but it's the same as with fiction. If something interests me and I don't know why, then I think it's worth writing about, in order to find out why.
And in the end, did you understand why you were interested in these characters, in this subject?
I'm just at the beginning of the book.
No, so the one about the Indian clerk.
Oh, the Indian Clerk. Well, that's a novel. It's an historical novel, but it's a novel. Yes, I did. I really did. I felt that that book, The Indian Clerk, is really about it's about sort of rationality and mysticism and how they clash. But and it was also an opportunity to write about Cambridge in that period when, with the apostles, there was so much, fantastically funny and interesting material about sort of the gay subculture at Cambridge. But really, that book turned out to be about a subject I never anticipated I would write about, which is a clash of religious values. You have a character who is a devout Hindu, and you have a character who is a devout atheist, which may sound like an oxymoron, a devout atheist, but God is very important to atheists. He's the enemy. That was how G.H. Hardy. That's a subject that continues to interest me. I grew up in a completely secular Jewish household with no religious education. Did I ever imagine that I would be so interested in religion and systems of belief? No, but maybe it's inevitable as you get older that you start thinking about these kinds of questions.
And which is your relationship with the science? Because in this book you talk a lot about science.
In The Indian Clerk?
Yeah, and also, of course, in the book about Alan Turing.
Right. Well, it's math more than science. I don't know really anything about I'm not a mathematician. My relationship to mathematics is like my relationship to music. I can appreciate it, but I can't do it. I found writing about mathematics was fascinating because, as Hardy says, it is as close as you can get to sort of undebatable truth. To truth, absolute truth, is the truth of mathematics. A mathematical proof is true in a way that almost nothing else is. And truth is something else that I'm very preoccupied with, especially because we're living in a time when even the word truth has been corrupted. Where there is, what is the truth? The truth these days seems to be people, what people believe. But I don't believe that belief and truth are synonymous. I'm very disturbed by the extent to which belief determines people's ideas of truth. I mean, if you look at the people who refuse to take the COVID vaccine, they have a whole mythology, a whole kind of alternate truth that they believe is the truth. But the truth is that some people are in hospitals on respirators and other people are healthy. And that can't, and the idea that that can be, that there are people who simply will not accept that is very frightening to me, because it suggests that that belief that there that what is true is what you believe to be true. It isn't. And that's true for me too, and for everyone.
And what is the relationship between literature and truth, in your
Well,
opinion?
I think literature has to pursue truth, although truth is elusive and not necessarily easy to find, but it has to be pursued. And I think that the only literature that matters is literature that is pursuing some kind of truth or looking for some kind of truth, um, as opposed to just recounting events.
And in your novels, in your short stories, you explore the relationship between people, between persons. How will these months that we pass together in isolation and so on can be reflected in storytelling?
I'm not sure yet. I'm sure people will find interesting ways to write about this. I mean, it was the same thing during the AIDS epidemic. It was there were a few very, very good books that were written about the AIDS epidemic during the AIDS epidemic, but there were also a lot of very bad books. And then subsequently, now we're starting to see some really interesting books about that period. But human beings need time to digest, and what crises take time is what crises take away from us. And so it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. One of some of my favorite books from the AIDS epidemic were written by writers who were dying as they wrote. Well, that became an impetus. I want to finish this book before I die. A lot of others had a certain. Well, let me add one other thing. I think the other thing that is most important alongside truth is humor. Humor is, to me, essential. I cannot read humorless fiction anymore. Now, I have a very broad definition of humor. Humor doesn't have to be the sort that will make you, howl with laughter, but there has to be humor. And I think that that is something that in the pandemic stories that I'm reading that have come into the magazine, complete absence of humor. There is humor in the pandemic. I mean, look at some of the memes that have been going around, the jokes, the videos that people have made. Those to me are infinitely more interesting than a lot of the fiction that I'm reading.
One last question. We began our conversation and you told me we're not after, we're still during the pandemic.
Yes, absolutely.
Which will be the sign that we are out of the pandemic, that we are really after? Can you see it in the future?
I don't know. I live in Florida, so we just are emerging from a huge, huge surge. So that affects my feeling if I lived in a part of the world where there hadn't just been a huge surge, I might answer differently. But when does it end? When people stop dying, when people stop being hospitalized, when we no longer need to wear masks. I don't know for sure that that day will ever come. I mean, you know, there are these, we don't know how the virus is going to mutate. We don't know what other pandemics may be around the corner. I think it's a mistake to imagine that you can return to the past. I mean, after World War II, the world was different. And I think there was, in the United States in the 1950s, a desperate effort to get back to normal as if the war hadn't happened. But it was impossible. The war changed everything. COVID changed everything. We can't. So I don't think I think it's a mistake to say that we're going back to normal. Whatever comes next is going to be different. There may be a new normal, but it won't. But pre-pandemic life, I don't think we will ever return to, because it's you know. For example, I mean, I cannot. My claustrophobia is so much worse. I cannot bear to be in a crowd. Well, before the pandemic, I was in crowds all the time. You know, will I get used to crowds again? I don't know. That's just a small example. So we'll see. But I certainly, you know, considering that in the United States, we now have 700,000 people dying, and that in the state of Alaska, doctors are having to make decisions about who will live and who will die because there's so many more patients than they can deal with. It's not over. You know, it's not over. We've been through, I mean, I'm not prepared to say that there's not going to be another surge in Florida. There could well be. So I think the mistake in imagining that it's over is that we all thought it was over in early July. And that turned out to not be the case. So I don't want to lie to myself only to be disappointed. I think it's better to be honest.
Last question. When can we read your next book?
When I finish it. I'm working now on a book, and it's nonfiction. I honestly don't know. This is going to distress my publishers, but I don't know if I will ever write fiction again. I have in mind at the moment, after I finish this book, another nonfiction book. However, I change my mind all the time, so who knows? But this will be no. And realistically, I hope to have this book finished by the summer. I have a sabbatical. I'm not teaching in the spring. The problem is this book is mostly about incidents that took place in India, and I really need to go back to India, and I can't go to India yet. So.
And what is your discipline or your daily routine when you write a book?
I wish I had one. I don't. I'm very undisciplined. But that's partially because I have a lot of other jobs. You know, I'm a teacher, I'm an administrator, I'm an editor. But I try to write in the mornings. The mornings are the best time for me. And but again, it depends. It's there are certain days, like I know Tuesdays and Wednesdays, no writing, because I teach on Tuesdays. So it varies. I'm not very disciplined. I wish I were.
Thank you so much, David Leavitt. Hope to see you in Milan soon.
Absolutely. Ciao.
Ciao.
Buona giornata.
Anche a te e a presto.
A presto.